Welcome everybody to today's Penn AI Tech webinar. Penn AI Tech is the Penn Artificial Intelligence and Technology Collaboratory for Healthy Aging, an initiative funded by the National Institute on Aging. Today, we're very happy to have as our speaker Dr. Mia Tackney. Mia is an NIHR Advanced Fellow at the MRC-Biostatistics Unit at the University of Cambridge. Her research is focused on statistical methods for digital outcome measures in clinical trials, including validation of novel digital outcomes, analysis of data at different levels of granularity, and handling complex patterns of missing data. She has a PhD from the University of Southampton and previously was a research associate at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I want to remind all our attendees that you can use the Q&A feature on Zoom to post any questions, and we should have some time at the end for Q&A. I thank you all for attending today's talk, and again, Dr. Tackney, thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. I will just share my slides. Can you see that in full screen now?
Yes, now it's full screen. Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. This presentation will be about 8 methodological questions that we have posed in order to try to bring attention to some methodological issues that we feel haven't really been addressed very much in the space of digital outcome measures for clinical trials. This is joint work with James Carpenter, who's at the UCL Innovative Clinical Trials Unit and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and Sophia Villar, who is at the MRC-BSU at the University of Cambridge. So I have 3 goals for this talk. I'd like first to tell you about the potential of digital outcome measures in clinical trials. Secondly, I'll go through the different methodological questions. Some of them are about the validation of these digital outcome measures. How do we know that they're just as good as traditional outcome measures? And some questions are to do with using them, deploying them in clinical trials. And thirdly, I want to illustrate what are some of the consequences of not fully considering these questions on the primary analysis of a clinical trial, and I'll do that through a simulation study. So we'll get started by talking about the potential of digital outcome measures. And I'll start with an example. So in many different disease areas that affect people's ability to do physical activity, that affect people's mobility, a gold standard outcome measure that's used in trials to test whether new treatments are working is called the 6-minute walk test. Here you're seeing a picture on the right-hand side of a child with Duchenne muscular dystrophy doing this 6-minute walk test. So essentially, you have to walk between 2 cones or down a corridor for 6 minutes, and the distance walked is a kind of measure of functional capacity of the person. It's also used in pulmonary hypertension and many other disease areas. Now, there are some recognized limitations for this as an outcome measure. First of all, it places high burden on patients because they have to come into the clinic in order to do this assessment, and that may potentially be quite a long and costly journey, especially for a rare disease such as Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It may not meaningfully measure the patient's experience, and it's known to be a snapshot measure, so it may be highly affected by how tired or how motivated the person is on the day of the assessment. In fact, there was a study which found that if you bribe children affected by Duchenne muscular dystrophy with some cash, they tend to walk faster. So recognizing some of these challenges, there's lots of interest in using digital health technology. So these are things like wearable devices, apps from smartphones, possibly implantable devices, in order to measure people's health outcomes remotely, potentially more conveniently in patients' chosen locations. So the idea is that this allows the trial to be decentralized. It could mean that measurements are taken more frequently and more conveniently, and potentially these outcome measures may be more sensitive. However, despite a vast interest in these wearable digital technologies for consumers and perhaps for observational studies in the context of clinical trials, using these as outcome measures, we are still in quite early stages of development, especially in terms of using these outcome measures as primary outcome measures in trials. So looking into some key examples, here we're looking at an ankle-worn device which was used to measure stride velocities for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And this way of summarizing the data as the 95th centile of stride velocity, this was approved by the European Medicines Agency as the first qualified digital outcome measure, qualified as a primary outcome measure. So this was a landmark example, and the qualification happened in 2022. Another key example is that time spent in moderate to vigorous physical activity using this wrist-worn device. This was approved by the FDA as a primary outcome measure in a specific trial. So this was a phase 3 trial for interstitial lung disease. So these two examples are some few examples where regulators have allowed digital outcome measures to be primary. Some other examples, so this is an implantable or an insertable cardiac monitor. It sits just underneath the skin, and it has been used in a number of early phase studies, early phase trials as an exploratory outcome in pulmonary hypertension. We'll be looking at some examples of data from this device later. And so far, these three examples have been passive monitoring examples. So essentially, the wearable device just sits there and is passively collecting data, but digital outcome measures can be active tests where the user, the participant has to do something active. So an example here is a digital platform called Floodlight, which was created by Roche and initially designed for multiple sclerosis. Here, one of the active tests is the symbol digit modalities test, which is a test of cognition. Another test for dexterity is where you have to squeeze a tomato, so it's a finger pinching test. And a third one is the U-turn test, so this is for mobility. So these are the kinds of things that we're talking about when it comes to digital outcome measures. And now we're going to get into some of the key methodological questions. So I'll be going through these one by one. Some of the earlier questions, so questions 1 to 3, are mostly to do with the validation of digital outcome measures. The rest of the questions are more to do with their use in clinical trials. So we'll start with the question, with the first question, which is, what is the appropriate granularity of the outcome measure? When you use these digital outcome measures, the data that you get is very different from the kinds of data that you get from traditional outcome measures. At the very basic raw level, you're getting physical signals from these devices. Here I'm showing acceleration, which was measured by an accelerometer. So you're looking at 100 times per second, a measurement of acceleration in 3 dimensions. And I'm only showing 30 minutes of data here, but it's already quite a large volume of data. And what typically happens is that this is then aggregated to the epoch level. So here you would summarize this into something that has a physiological meaning. So it could, for example, be step count per minute. And here the minute is the epoch. And at this level of granularity, you can plot the entire measurement period. Here it's a week, and you can see that there are patterns over the course of a day. And you can see that there's still quite a large volume of data here. And what typically happens in the clinical trials context is that this gets aggregated yet again into a scalar summary of this entire measurement period. So you could get, for example, the average of the total step count per day. So you're condensing this large amount of data into a single summary metric. Now, this process of condensing things into this single summary metric, this involves aggregation on a number of different levels. So you get from the raw data to the epoch level data to the summary level data. And as you move through these different levels of granularity, you can see that many different decisions are potentially being made, and there's potentially quite a lot of discretion. So you may need to choose the epoch level. You may need to think, how am I going to summarize the data at each level? You may need to think about the outliers, what you may do with missing data. And depending on your choice of device, it may be that the algorithm may be proprietary and you may not know exactly what kind of decisions are being made. So this is essentially the first question, is thinking about the fact that the data can be aggregated, understood, analyzed at very different levels, depending on your goal for the analysis. And that's something to really keep in mind. Now I'm going to describe some of the details around validating these digital outcome measures. So how do you know that this way of summarizing the digital outcome measure is a valid metric? Now, validation has been described in terms of this V3 plus framework, which was proposed by the Digital Medicine Society. They broke down the process of validation into these 4 component parts. This includes usability validation. This includes asking questions such as who, for what context, for what purpose is this device intended? What are some of the risks involved? How do you design studies to try to reduce some of these risks? And what are the considerations around inclusivity and acceptability for patients when it comes to these devices? Then verification, which is also sometimes referred to as technical validation. This is to do with the accuracy or precision of the raw data. So typically this involves doing experiments on the benchtop on the devices themselves. So in the image here, you're looking at an accelerometer that's being swung side to side, and you can test the consistency within and across devices. Next, we get to analytical validation, and this is about whether you're able to capture a physiological metric. So, for example, in that iconic example of stride velocity 95th centile for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, in order to understand how accurate the wearable device was, they compared the strides that were captured by the wearable device against strides that were captured by a motion capture room. So that's accuracy. They also looked into a number of other validation criteria by considering a number of different scalar summaries, such as the median stride velocity, the 95th centile stride velocity, and mean distance walked, and evaluating them in terms of reliability. So reliability is whether measurements that are taken successively, very close in time apart by individuals, whether they are going to be close to each other. And this is typically characterized via the intracluster correlation coefficient. They also looked into robustness, so how stable the measurements are when you vary certain conditions, such as the wear time duration or contextual factors, whether it's a weekend or a weekday. Then there's clinical validation, which is how well these digital outcome measures and these summary metrics can encapsulate something that has a clinical meaning. So convergent validity, this is about the correlation between the digital outcome measure and the gold standard outcome measure. So here we're comparing the stride velocity 95th centile with the gold standard 6-minute walk test and seeing that there is a correlation between them. Furthermore, you can see in this plot that in blue are the healthy control participants, and in red are participants with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And you can see that there's a fairly clear separation between these two groups. So this is known groups validity. And finally, a really key criteria is the sensitivity to disease progression or to treatment. And what was found in the validation studies around stride velocity 95th centile was that this metric could detect change both in terms of deterioration, but also in terms of improvement due to treatment earlier than the traditional outcome measures. So these are the kinds of criteria that need to be met when it comes to validating digital outcome measures. And in thinking about this, there's 2 questions that we wanted to pose. The first is, what is the appropriate measurement period? when you're using these digital outcome measures, participants have to wear a device or engage with these devices for quite a long period of time, and what an appropriate measurement period is an important question. Some studies take the perspective of looking at repeated windows over time, so it could be a week at baseline, a week at follow-up, and so on. And here there's recognition that longer periods will reduce the variability in the summary metric, and it will allow for you to look into the daily, weekly, monthly patterns, but it needs to be balanced against compliance and burden, and understanding this trade-off can be very challenging. Some other studies have taken the approach of longer term monitoring, so monitoring people over a very long period of time, sometimes over years. But there's recognition that engagement tends to drop off quickly, especially for active tests compared to passive monitoring. And you can see that there's some work that's been done on the Floodlight app for multiple sclerosis in this reference here. The next question, still on the topic of validation, is how is that ideal summary metric chosen? In the example of stride velocity 95th centile, they chose a stride velocity 95th centile amongst a number of pre-specified scalar summaries that have a clear clinical interpretation. But recently, there's been some interesting work done on using data-driven approaches in order to extract summary metrics. For example, lots of digital outcome measures measure some kind of physiological phenomena that can be characterized by a curve or a function. And here, an example being gait data, as you can see in the plot here. Some tools such as functional principal components analysis could be useful in these contexts, as it allows you to look at these individuals' curves and to break them down into an overall mean function and eigenfunctions that are orthogonal. And for each individual, you can come up with a scalar summary, a score, which tells you how each individual deviates from the overall mean function in the direction of these eigenfunctions. There's also interest in using machine learning approaches to combine data from different physiological metrics. For example, if you have something like the Floodlights app, which includes many different active tests as well as passive monitoring. So here, there's this question recognizes that there's lots of different ways to extract a summary metric from this vast amount of data that's collected by digital outcome measures. Now, turning to our next question, we are now thinking about the fact that while there might be interest in summarizing this data into a scalar, there might be a lot more that we can learn by exploiting the granularity of the digital outcome measure in order to learn about clinical change. So in this example here, we're looking at analysis that involved generalized additive models, and these use smooth terms as a function of time in order to look at, for example, how physical activity changes over the course of a day. So in this plot here, we're looking at smooth curves of functional activity for patients who have ALS. They were asked to wear an accelerometer for a period of 1 week, and they had to repeat this over several weeks. And you can see that in black at week 0, the physical activity increases, and then there's a peak in the middle of the day, and then it declines. Now, as the weeks go on, the volume of physical activity declines overall, but by week 48 in orange, you can see this dip in the middle of the day. That's a kind of insight that you would lose if you were focusing just on scalar summary metrics. So by using these potentially these smooth terms and looking at flexible modeling approaches, it may help you to inform times of day when outcome measures may be more sensitive. So this example is looking looking at deterioration. However, there may be interest in understanding more about clinical change using these granular outcome measures. What we're seeing here is data from the implantable device, which was used in an early phase trial in pulmonary hypertension. Here at day 0 on the axis, treatment is initiated, and you can see that very quickly there is a change in the systemic and pulmonary resistance, which then plateaus. later on, when the treatment is withdrawn, we see that the systemic and pulmonary resistance increases again, but at a different rate. So, with this highly granular, high frequency data, there's potential to understand much more about the time course of treatment response. However, as trial statisticians, we may be less experienced in using time series methods. So there's a big opportunity here in thinking about how to transport some of these methods from other areas into the trials methodology space. So question 4 was about some novel, exciting, interesting insights that could be gained thanks to the granular nature of the digital outcome measure. The next question, though, is about whether we need to be cautious about specific aspects, such as seasonal and behavioral variations that come into play. For example, we know from some analyses that were done in this really interesting paper on the Floodlights app, which was for multiple sclerosis, that there can be a practice effect when it comes to using active tests. They found that in the symbol digit modalities test, there's actually a long-term practice effect, and individuals may reach 50% of this practice effect after 11 repetitions of doing the active test. This was an analysis that was achieved through a bounded growth mix model. For the finger pinching test, they found that there was small to modest practice effects. And for the U-turn test, the mobility test, they found that there was minimal long-term practice effects. So understanding these potential behavioral variations is important because in the context of an observational study, these long-term practice effects could exaggerate the effect of treatment, or it could potentially mask deterioration. And now moving into a much more long-term setting. On the right-hand side here, we're looking at data from the implantable device on patients who have pulmonary hypertension. And we're looking at the top activities of daily living. So this is to do with physical activity, and it was measured by a single-axis accelerometer that's in the implantable device. You can see that during the days of the year, in the summer, the physical activity is higher compared to the winter months. And you can see that in comparison, the other outcome measures remain stable. So this is telling us that physical activity measured by a wearable device passively, this is going to vary by season. And it's not just a measure of people's capacity to do exercise, but it's also about preference towards exercise, which has a seasonal component. So this has some important implications for design or analysis of studies with these digital outcome measures. So in the context of an observational or in single arms study, there's potential that you may introduce bias due to these seasonal variations. In the context of a trial with a randomized treatment, thanks to the concurrent control arm, you would unlikely to see bias. However, you do need to think carefully about the timing of recruitment, and you may want to adjust for season in the analysis because this can lead to an increase in the standard error of the treatment effect. Our next question is about missing data and how they should be handled in the context of digital outcome measures. So in this space, it's actually quite difficult to define what missing data is. On the right-hand side, we're looking at data from an accelerometer from one participant over 7 days. So we're looking at data from midnight one day to midnight the next. And you can see that, for example, here there is a gap at the start of the day, but it's not quite clear if this is missing data, if the person did not wear the device at this part of the day, or if they were simply sleeping a little bit longer that day, because this was a device where participants did not have to wear it in their sleep. Now, looking at the day before, there is a much longer period of missingness. For another person, there's an entire day that appears to be missing. For another person, there's several days within the week that's missing. So actually, it's quite challenging to have a clear definition of what missingness is. And what tends to be current practice is that people will look at something like wear time and use a threshold on wear time to define what a missing day is. But often these wear time thresholds are chosen ad hoc. Several different wear time thresholds may be used across many different studies, and they may not necessarily be validated for the specific population. Some of our previous work has looked into defining missingness on the epoch level, allowing shorter intervals of time within the day to be imputed, taking into account the time of day and factors such as weather or season that can be important auxiliary variables when it comes to missing data. There's also an important question around sensitivity analyses. Typically, analyses will assume that the data are missing at random, but of course, there is the potential that missingness may occur in a way that varies with the outcome that you're trying to measure itself. For example, individuals may remove the devices on those days when they are less physically active, in which case sensitivity analyses would be really important. Now, our next two questions, the question 7 and question 8, they bring together several different aspects that we've already covered. Question 7 is, what are appropriate estimands for digital outcome measures? So estimands provide a precise way of explaining what the treatment effect is, looking at these 5 component parts. And this question recognizes that moving from a traditional to a digital outcome measure can impact each of these different components. So when the variable becomes digital, this means that you have high frequency measurements. Hopefully they are quite sensitive to clinical change, but there's going to be an impact on that population level summary. It needs to be a validated summary, and considerations around seasonal or behavioral variation and missing data become important. There's also a question about whether the population may shift as a result of changing the digital outcome measure, changing to a digital outcome measure. Perhaps it may broaden the target population because it allows inclusion of people in geographically remote areas, or there could be a shift due to digital exclusion. There may be concerns about unequal access to devices and stable network connections. So these are important considerations. And there may be also new intercurrent events, such as software updates or device malfunction. So in this paper by authors at Novartis, there's really nice considerations of how decentralization more broadly can impact each of these different aspects of the estimand. Our final question is whether evidence synthesis is possible. A recent review of 21 diabetes trials identified 266 different digital outcome measures, most of them used as exploratory outcomes. So we're seeing a proliferation of different digital outcome measures in lots of different spaces, including observational studies and also in the trial space. However, their use as primary outcome measures is still very limited. And even if you pick one of these 266 digital outcome measures, there's many different points of discretion, especially when it comes to software implementation, which means that there are very large challenges for evidence synthesis going forward. So there's a need for standardization, and there is a question around whether it would be important to draw from existing frameworks such as those on core outcome sets. So these are the 8 methodological questions that we posed in this paper. And what I'd now like to do is to illustrate the consequences on a primary analysis of a clinical trial if you do not consider fully some of these questions. And this simulation study is based around a real clinical trial. I'll be focusing on 3 questions. The first is about the measurement period. Second question is about seasonal or behavioral variation. And the last question is about missing data. So our simulation study is loosely based on this phase 2 trial. This trial was by Bellerophon Therapeutics, and it asked the question of whether inhaled nitric oxide through this delivery system here, whether that improves physical activity in patients who have pulmonary hypertension associated with interstitial lung disease. In this trial, 44 patients were randomized to treatment on a 2-to-1 ratio, and the timeline looked like this. So at baseline, individuals had to wear this actigraph wrist-worn device for a month. Then they were randomized to one of the two treatments. Then in month 5, they had to wear this wrist-worn device again. A number of different outcomes were studied in this trial, including the traditional 6-minute walk test, oxygen saturation, time spent in moderate to vigorous physical activity. This was through the actigraph watch, among other outcomes. And in this trial, there was a statistically significant difference between the two treatment groups in terms of the time spent in MBPA. And as a consequence, the FDA approved this digital outcome, time spent in MBPA, in a subsequent phase 3 trial as a primary outcome. And switching to this digital outcome measure meant that there was a substantial reduction in sample size. However, this phase 3 trial was eventually stopped for futility. Now, our simulation study will be loosely based on this structure, and what we want to do is to ask, what is the impact on the primary analysis of the digital outcome measure if, due to seasonality, some patients are recruited in wintertime and they have their follow-up in the summer, and just for the reason that they are recruited in the summer, they have a higher time spent in MBPA follow-up. What's the consequence on the primary analysis? We also want to ask, what if, due to an observer effect, so when participants first use the devices, it might be that they have a heightened sense of being observed or are particularly excited about the device, and perhaps they're more active on the first week compared to the other weeks at follow-up. What's the consequence if this measurement period is 2 weeks instead of 4 weeks? And finally, what's the consequence if the outcomes are missing in a completely random way or missing in a non-random way, specifically that people remove the device on days when they are less active? Now, getting into some of the details, in the simulation study, the primary analysis is going to be a simplified analysis of the digital outcome measure. We denote by YIJ the daily time spent in MBPA for individual I on day J at follow-up. And we average those J days for individual I's to get a YI bar. So that's the average time spent in MBPA for individual I. And we compute this average just for the compliant days. And a compliant day is when someone has worn the device for 600 minutes. This was how they defined it in this particular trial. Now, the primary analysis is going to regress the average time spent in MBPA to the average time spent in MBPA at baseline and the treatment. In our simulation study, we're going to simulate data on the day level. So we're going to assume that the time spent in MBPA for each day has a log normal distribution because this is a right-skewed outcome. We're going to assume that it has mean given by mu ij and standard deviation given by 46. Now, mu ij has several different components. It includes the baseline time spent in MBPA, which also has a log normal distribution with mean 77 and standard deviation 52. It has a treatment effect, which is 12.5 minutes per day. This was the treatment effect that was found in the trial. We're now going to add a few different potential effects. So here we have the seasonal effect. We're going to assume that for some participants who were recruited in the winter and their follow-up is in the summer, there's going to be an additive effect just due to the season, and it could be between 0 and 10 minutes per day. In addition, it could potentially interact with the treatment, and that's going to be a proportion of that effect due to season. In a very similar way, we're going to assume that there could be an additive effect due to the observer effect, meaning that there will be an added amount to the time spent in MVPA in week 1 compared to the other weeks at follow-up, and that it could potentially interact with treatment. And we also have a random effect for patient I. We're also going to consider that this measurement period could be either 4 weeks as it was in the trial or a shorter period of 2 weeks. Then there's going to be a missing data mechanism. So in this study, days with wear time greater than 600 minutes were defined as compliant and included in the analysis. Otherwise, they were considered missing. We're going to look at 2 different scenarios. In the first scenario, we're going to make a random selection of days missing. And in another scenario, we're going to make days that are less active missing. So this is missing, not at random. Now I'm going to get into some of the results of the simulation study. What we're seeing is at the top, the mean of the treatment effect across 10,000 simulations, and at the bottom, the standard error of the treatment effect across 10,000 simulations. So in the absence of any seasonal effect, the mean of the treatment effect is around 12.5. This is as expected. Now, let's assume that 10% of the population experience this seasonal effect. As the magnitude of that seasonal effect increases, there's no impact on the mean of the treatment effect. However, there is an increase in the standard error. If the proportion of people that experience that seasonal effect increases, that standard error increases as well. We've got 20% in purple and 50% in the light blue. Now, if there is an interaction between the seasonal effect and the treatment effect, we will see that there is, in fact, bias in addition to the increase in standard error. So some implications are that you want to consider carefully how you're recruiting people throughout the year if you have a digital outcome measure that may have seasonality, and you want to consider adjusting for season in the analysis. Next, we're looking at the observer effect. So this is where individuals may be more active on the first week out of the 4 weeks. And in our simulation, we're going to assume that all participants experience the observer effect. And in this case, there's no impact on the mean or on the standard error. However, if it's only a proportion of individuals that experience this observer effect, you would find that there's an increase in the standard error, as we did in the previous slide with the seasonality. If there is an interaction with the treatment, however, you will see that there is a bias incurred. And now we're going to consider shortening the measurement period from 4 weeks to 2 weeks. If that's the case, we see that there's an increase in the bias under the interaction, and in terms of the standard error, what used to be a standard error of around 2.8 is now around 4, so there is quite a large impact on the standard error. Lastly, we're going to consider missing data. Here, we have that the true effective treatment, again, is 12.5 minutes per day. And we're going to assume that 10% of participants have missing data, but it's missing in a completely random way. As the proportion of days that are missing increases along the x-axis, we see that there's no impact on the mean of the treatment effect, so there's no bias. However, there is an increase in standard error. And as the proportion of participants with missing data increases to 20% and to 50%, that standard error increases even further. And finally, if data is missing not at random, so if those days where participants have less physical activity, when those days are specifically missing, you end up overestimating that treatment effect. So there is a real need for sensitivity analyses to missing data assumptions, and it may be that imputing missing data on a lower level of granularity, this was some of the work we did previously, this may be useful in certain settings. So bringing together some of what we've discussed to realize the full potential of digital outcome measures, important methodological challenges need to be addressed, and we summarize this through these 8 questions that were presented here. And our simulation study highlighted that there are some potential consequences to the primary analysis of a trial with the digital outcome measures if some of these questions are not fully considered. So this is a kind of call to action to bring attention into these methodological questions, especially now as there's lots of interest in using digital health technologies in trials. So thank you very much for your attention, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And just to remind our attendees that you can use the Q&A feature for any questions you have for our speaker. And I'll start first. I think the 8 questions you posed are all really excellent points that give us more thought as we think about new digital tools. I'm wondering, you already talked about the granularity and how it can perhaps be used for us to detect clinical change. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about whether this type of granular digital outcome measures can help us move beyond prediction towards understanding mechanisms of change, especially when we are measuring things, let's say in the home, that we don't really know exactly what we should be expecting or why things should change. And much of it could be exploratory. Do you think there's more potential with that, because of that granularity, to have more mechanistic insights?
Oh, absolutely. So, that example of the implantable device, which is recording a number of different cardiac outcomes and sits just underneath the skin, that has the potential to provide insights into the mechanism of action of the treatment because you're getting data that's closer to the source. So you're getting, right close to the physiological metrics compared to outcome measures that may be things like the 6-minute walk test or outcome measures that are not granular enough. So I think there is a huge potential there. And what you mentioned about different devices in the home where you may see changes that they may be not necessarily linked to clinical change. Is that what you mean, that there may be a number of different confounders? I think
Yes.
that's an important challenge because it may be that a number of different aspects could induce changes. For example, it might be that a recent infection leads to changes in certain outcome measures, and they're not actually affecting the underlying disease that you're interested in. So I think there is really a need to think carefully about how to bring the clinical context into interpretation of the digital outcome measures. So yeah, I think that there are kind of two sides to it, I suppose.
And related to this, I was wondering if you can comment more on the challenge of noise with that type of granularity. And I know within Penn AI Tech, we have pilot awardees who are looking at using sensors in the home or trying to understand gait. And a lot of it could be noise because you have visitors in the home or other things happening that are not really of importance. In some cases, you also have patterns that individuals display that may not be characteristic of the larger population, but it's because this group of people may have unique circumstances due to cognitive impairment or other specific issues. So it's always a challenge in terms of identifying noise and making sure that noise is truly noise rather than actually differences across population subgroups. So I would love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I guess noise can be understood at different levels. So maybe at the analytical level, if you, for example, have two devices on the same person, you may find that those two devices measure outcomes slightly differently. So there is a noise between the devices. So that's kind of one level of noise, kind of an analytical variability. But then you may have additional sources of noise, kind of the examples that you provided. it could be that there are changes happening that are not relevant to the condition that you're interested in, or the kind of behavioral characteristics that are existing only in specific individuals and are again not related to the outcome. So I suppose potentially there's need to collect additional data in addition to these wearable or digital outcomes that provide you with a bit more context to understand what's important. Um, and I think part of this is also to do with the question, how long is the measurement period, and how long you are aggregating data over. Um, it may be that some of this noise will not become important over time. But if you're looking at a shorter period of time, it may be that these potential confounders have a big influence. So yeah, this is a really good question.
We do have a question about whether people can access your presentation. And just to remind folks, this is being recorded and we will be posting it on our YouTube channel within a couple of days. So everybody registered for this talk will receive the link. And also you could contact the speaker directly if you had further questions about the slides or the material. Before folks write any other questions, if there's any questions in the Q&A, I wanted to ask you also, you mentioned the V3 plus validation framework, and I'm not familiar with that. One of the aspects you mentioned was also usability. Is that the usability of the actual tools that are being used for digital measures and how end users interact with them? And if so, is that a set of criteria that a researcher uses to assess it, or how is that being practically applied?
Oh, that's a great question. So originally it was called the V3 framework, and then an update to the V3 plus framework was this addition of this usability component. So this was a kind of recent addition to the framework to emphasize how important these aspects are. So it is about usability. I think it's part of it to do with the usability from the perspective of the individual using the device, but it can also be usability from the perspective of the site staff, the staff managing the trial. There may be additional components. I'm not too familiar about the implementation side of things, but from what I understand, it's usability from the user side, but also more broadly speaking. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We have another question. One of our attendees says, as someone with less knowledge on simulation methods and concepts, I'm wondering if you have recommendations on resources to learn more about the types of methods you used in your study.
Okay, yeah. So in terms of simulation methods, there are quite a lot of guidance papers out there around conducting simulation studies. So, for example, there is a paper by Tim Morris and co-authors on an ADAMP framework, which is a way of structuring a simulation study and reporting on it. So that's one place to start. If the question was more about methodology for the analysis, design and analysis of trials using digital outcomes that we discussed, in our 8 questions paper, the references will be linking to many of those methods used. And also, I suppose when the slides are online, you'll be able to see the references given inside the slides too.
That's great. Let me see if there's any other questions. I don't see any other questions. Um, I want to thank you again for this wonderful talk and for sharing your expertise with us today. I want to remind folks that our next webinar will be with Dr. Paul Barr from the Dartmouth Institute for Health Policy and Clinical Practice, focusing on ambient clinical visit recording and AI in older adult care. And again, our webinar series is being recorded and available on our YouTube channel. Um, And so with that, Dr. Tackney, again, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to everybody for attending.